What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Orange Crushin It Podcast, a Jenks Island production. I'm your host, Ty McGee, and in today's episode, we are going to be discussing some of the Denver Broncos staff moves thus far this offseason, some of the offensive line and interior defensive line draft fits that we've been talking about over on the Jenks Island podcast. We're breaking down those position groups week over week. Coming up, we'll do the tight ends, but make sure you go check out those videos, like, comment, subscribe. But I will be talking about, those guys from the video that would be good fits for Denver in rounds like 2, 3, and 4. And then I'll be talking a little bit about David Montgomery, the Detroit Lions running back, who has been rumored to be a target for Denver, with the possibility that we move on from J.K. Dobbins. And then at the end, we'll do a quick mock draft. I'll probably do a mock draft every episode just to see how that evolves as the offseason goes on. As we get connected to more guys, we fill roles in free agency via trade. So, we'll do a quick 7-round mock draft for the Denver Broncos. But first, we'll jump into the staff moves. And first up is Davis Webb, the offensive coordinator, who replaces Joe Lombardi, who was fired this offseason. Lombardi has been around with Sean Payton for quite some time, kind of as that right-hand man for Sean, left a little bit to be the offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Chargers. Didn't really have a ton of success there, kind of a failed role. And seemingly same thing when he came back, right? He called plays there. He didn't call plays here. And I just think that it was time for him to move on. I wasn't a fan of kind of just having a guy on staff that, quite honestly, I felt like was doing nothing. Sean was kind of carrying the load on the offensive side, and I feel like Lombardi was not helping him, kind of grow as a play caller, even at an older age. So I think Davis coming in, right, brings a fresh perspective, a guy that was in the league a couple years ago, a guy who, was a quarterback. He has a good relationship with Bo Nix. Will be a little bit fresher, has called some plays for us in the preseason against the Arizona Cardinals, and a drive that, was really smooth. One of the most efficient drives, honestly, that I thought we had all season. Evan Ingram was heavily involved. Pat Bryant was involved. A lot of these guys that we want to see more involved next season, Davis did a great job of involving them in the offense. So I think there's a lot of room for growth with this offense, and that's saying a lot. We went to the AFC Championship game, albeit, our defense was the strength of the team, but the offense, especially with Bo, got a lot better as the season went on. So I'm excited to see what goes on there. People might be wondering, what is the signal for Sean Payton? Is he considering retirement? None of those rumors have come out yet, but you never know, right? Could this be a changing of the guard? Could he win a Super Bowl and kind of pass the baton to Davis, and he becomes the next head coach of the Denver Broncos? You never know, because Davis Webb, had some offensive coordinator jobs that were offered to him, but he was also interviewing for the Raiders head coach job. So you don't know what's kind of going on inside the building, but it does seem like this would be, a fit if Sean was thinking about that. But at the bare minimum, it's just to help this offense grow and to retain a really, really, up and coming and smart young candidate in Davis Webb. So love that move. And then moving into the passing game coordinator role, right, we bring in John Morton, who replaced Zach Rossi, who joined with the Ravens. Morton was with the Broncos 2 years ago and then rejoined us late last season. He was the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions in the intermediate, and I think he was kind of scapegoated out of there. I thought he did a decent job, and maybe some of that burden should have fell more on Dan Campbell or Jared Goff, but I thought Goff played well, but I think, just at times he's not situationally clutch, and Campbell loves to go for it on fourth down all the time, and it's just not going to work. At some point, you got to take your point. So, love John coming back in, and I think he drew up the plays. He drew up some plays, but he drew up the Frank Trump touchdown that we threw in the playoffs, and I think that showcases creativity. The play drawing role is so key. The Rams talk about it a ton. Sean McVay, a lot of guys that have kind of come through that coaching tree. Started at the play drawing position, and obviously John Morton, it's a little bit different than that, but you could see the importance of play drawing, and he did that, right? He drew up a touchdown to an offensive lineman in a playoff game. So love bringing him back, especially as a veteran guy, to help Davis come along as the OC. Then you had Logan Kilgore at the quarterback's coach. He obviously replaces Davis as the QB's coach, and this is a guy that spent the 2014 offseason with the New Orleans Saints, so there's some comfortability and familiarity with the Sean Payton, with the playbook. This is a guy who played in the CFL for a little bit, played at a small school. So, he's a quarterback. I think he'll be good in Bo's ear, but I think he'll also, just grow a ton with the guys that are around him. And, it helps, obviously, the familiarity with the scheme and the playbook. And then I think outside of probably Davis Webb, the biggest hire we made was Ronald Curry, who replaced Kerry Colbert, who got fired. As the wide receivers coach, it's so important that you get a lot of these young guys to come along, and Kerry was not able to do that. Franklin got better, but he still struggled. Pat Bryant was decent. I think that he had more injury history that, the concussions that kind of held him back. Mims wasn't really involved, but when he was awesome. And then Sutton was underwhelming. So it was time to move on. And Ronald Curry, I know there's Saints fans out there on Twitter that are telling me this guy's lazy. I find that hard to believe when, his time with the Saints as the wide receivers coach, it was Michael Thomas's best years. He won Offensive Player of the Year. Then he spent some time with the Bills as the quarterbacks coach. Josh Allen wins MVP, has a lot of success. And Joe Brady comes out and says, this is a rising coach. It's kind of my right-hand man. I just struggle to believe that this guy isn't going to pan out. I think it might just be Saints fans, man, that were taking all the guys that were once upon a time in their coaching tree. But I love the Ronald Curry ad. I think he's going to help bring the best out of Courtland Sutton, maybe get Mims more involved. Brian, if you listen to Jenks over on the Jenks Island podcast, he thinks that, he's kind of a Michael Thomas light. The way that he runs intermediate and short routes so well, I think that, it's a decent comp. And I think if he can get the best out of Pat Bryant and kind of get him to be 1,000-yard receiver at bare minimum, that would be awesome. And Troy Franklin, who has Pro Bowl aspirations, if he can get, him to be 1,000-yard receiver as well, that would be awesome. But I think I hope that we add to the wide receiver room. AJ Brown's been rumored. I would love that. But I think Ronald Curry can bring the best out of some of the guys that we already have in the room. Then the last position on the offensive side, Kyle Kempt, an offensive assistant. He was the quarterback for David Montgomery in college. Also, our running backs coach, Lou Ayeni, was one of his coaches. So I think there's some connections there. But I think he was the OC at Drake as well. Like to have a guy who has called plays come in as an assistant. I think a lot of it will be more of a learning process for him. But I think he can provide some stuff there for sure. Then you look at the defensive side. Defensive passing game coordinator Robert Livingston was the CU DC last season. This is a guy that's replacing Jim Leonard, who left for the Bills DC job. Replacing a guy who left for your DC job with a guy who was a DC. Pretty good. I like it. We got to see what Robert Livingston brings, but it does sound like he is an up-and-coming coach. Colorado's defense wasn't great, but, that could be a function of, kind of just the guys they had in that room and the inability to acquire talent in the transfer portal. And then the last guy that we hired, the DB's coach from USC, Doug Belk, who had a lot of success there this past season. Kamari Ramsey and Bishop Fitzgerald, both guys that are really rising prospects. Bishop Fitzgerald was an All-American after transferring in. I love the job that he did there. I'm a USC football fan. So both those guys got to see them week in and week out, and they were truly amazing. Bishop Fitzgerald just really has a knack for getting to the ball. So excited to see what he can do there, and excited, maybe if he can add two of those guys in the 4th and 5th round. I'll talk about them and add them into the draft fits a little bit. But love the Doug Belk hiring. And then we have 2 open spots at the cornerbacks position with Addison Lynch, who was fired, and the senior assistant on the offensive side with Pete Carmichael, who joined the Bills as their offensive coordinator. There is some rumors that maybe another senior assistant could be joining on the defensive side, Mike Zimmer. He's a guy that has a ton of defensive coordinators experience, head coach experience as well. Would love to add a real veteran guy, in this on this defense. We got Vance, who's a veteran. We lose BT Jordan. Bell comes in, he's a young guy. Livingston, new to the NFL. I think that you need a more veteran presence, and Mike Zimmer is a guy that for sure could bring that and be, kind of a right-hand man to Vance Joseph. So hopeful that one pans out. But jumping into some of the draft fits, first I'll talk about Ramsey and Fitzgerald. I think you can get them in the 4th and 5th round, and I think that they would be great fits right behind Brandon Jones and Hufanga. Hufanga's had some injury history. Brandon Jones had some injuries last season and is also coming up on a free agent. He's a free agent, I think, next season. So, you need to start thinking about succession planning. Bo's going to need a contract extension eventually. You can't pay everyone on the defensive side, so you need to have some young guys that build up in your system and then take over that role. And, with PJ Locke as a free agent, I don't think we'll bring him back, maybe on a 1-year deal. And the other guys behind him, we're special teams contributors, aren't really going to be guys that at this point I think will, contribute as starters on the defensive side. So really got to look at replacing and just creating depth behind those two guys, Hufanga and Brandon Jones. It's one of the weaker depth spots we have on the team. Corner and edge have a ton of depth. Even linebacker and D line, like I would say that they're deeper than what we have at safety. It probably really is the weakest, depth spot on our defense. Obviously, the starters are awesome, but without PJ Locke, you don't really have much there. Like I said, some of these guys are special teamers, but you need to have guys that can step in if one of those guys goes down with injury again. So those are two fits at the safety position. We'll talk about the safeties and a couple of DBs as a whole in a couple of weeks on the Jenks Island podcast. And then I'll bring over some, the holistic view of different draft fits that I have. But I'll start to do this, pretty much every week, talk about some of the guys that we cover over on Jenks Island and then how they would fit into the Denver scheme. Because over there, it's more about, overall draft stuff. Over here, more about the Denver Broncos. So I think those two guys would be good fits. Then we start to look at the offensive line. I think Max Einacher out of Arizona State is one guy that could be a fit, maybe in the third round. He's got a lot of growth to do, but he's a big fella. I think he needs some more, weight in his trunk, but he could be an option at right tackle. He is a right tackle as a kind of a replacement for McGlinchey eventually. I think we should move on from Matt Purr. Frank Crumb's, he's all right. And Palczewski's probably going to bump into guard full time, I would think. So, I think we need to get a developmental tackle, and Einacher, if he's a guy that's there in the third or even the fourth, I think that he's a good developmental tackle, just given his size. Blake Miller's a guy that you'd probably have to take in the second round. Maybe he falls. I think he's worthy of a first-round pick. He was kind of one of the bright spots on Clemson's roster. Another right tackle that I think could take over the right tackle job quicker than definitely quicker than Einacher, but quicker than maybe we would imagine, and be able to get some cap relief with Mike McGlinchey, maybe being a cap casualty as he gets a little bit older. He's still doing a good job, but I think there's definitely a little bit of room for improvement if you're going to be, one of the upper echelon teams in the NFL like we have been. And then I think the last guy would be Caden Proctor. Caden Proctor is probably going to be a first-round pick. I definitely don't want him in the first round. But he is, he's a big physical guy, a real grader, in the run game, mauler. But I think that, he needs to lose some weight. He lacks like that lateral quickness, and he's not a great athlete. And I think if he loses some weight, he'll have to, learn a little bit more about, just in pass pro and not just being able to run dudes over and just absolutely throw them around, because when you lose some of that weight, you lose some of that power. So I would like him as a developmental guy. I tweeted about this the other day, but I just, he's going to go in the first round. And I think that we have bigger targets that we need to go after in the first round. And this is just not offensive tackle is not one of them right now. I think interior defensive line is a much bigger need, tight end, linebacker. So I would love Proctor, but I don't think it's going to happen. And then on the interior offensive line, I think two guys that are absolute beast, just absolute maulers, and that's what I want on my guards: Chase Bisontis and Keelan Rutledge. Two guys that I've kind of highlighted on the Jenks Island podcast. I really loved them and what they brought. Kind of different. Keelan Rutledge almost reminds me, kind of mostly of Ben Powers. That run grade mauler, run game mauler. He's a bigger guy. They run a lot at Georgia Tech. I think he'd be an awesome fit. I mocked him to us in the last mock draft. And then Chase Bisontis, who kind of is more like I see him more as like a Quinn Miners kind of guy, not on that level, but a real, physical pass rusher. This is a guy that wants to like take you off the screen a lot of the time, wants to really pancake you. I loved it. Both these guys really got me going on film. I think that they would be, really, really solid ads on the interior offensive line if we decide to move on from Ben Powers and to give some competition to Palczewski. I think you bring Palczewski back on his tender or maybe a shorter deal because we need to see him as a full-time guard for a full year. I thought he did a really good job in replacement of Powers, but I think you can move on from Powers, get some cap relief and take one of these guys in the second or third round and really, really solidify this offensive line for the long term. No one else on the interior offensive line do I really think, would be great for us. Jennings Dunker's not bad. I don't think we need to add at the center position. We saw Forsyth do a really great job when Wattenberg went down. So I think both of those guys, kind of lock down the center position. And I think guard is just, that left guard position, a little bit of a question mark with depending on what you do with Ben Powers and what you do with Palczewski. Then moving to the interior defensive line, a couple guys that I really like in the first round would be Lee Hunter and Caleb Banks out of Florida and Lee Hunter out of Texas Tech. Both these guys are just absolute beasts. Hunter is that kind of that nose tackle, 3-tech type of guy, can play both. I would love him as a JFM replacement. He's a true power guy, really, really plays well in the run game, but as a pass rusher, I think there's some development there, but the way that he brings power in the pass rush game is, there was multiple plays where I just audibly said, "Oh my God," parsing my words right now, but I was shocked at how good he was and the power that he brought. One of the plays, go turn on the film, he knocks over one of the BYU guards and just carries him into Bear Bachmeier's lap. So, yeah, that guy's an absolute mauler. He's my number one defensive tackle in this class, and Banks is my number two. He's a real athletic guy. Kind of looks like he has a similar frame to JFM. Has some growth to do. I think he can develop a better pass rush bag too. But, you can't teach, some of the physicality that he has, and you can't teach just the athletic freak that he is. He had the same vertical jump as Brawny. And this guy is 6'6", 320 pounds. So, think about that. Absolute freak. And Vance Joseph would have a field day with this guy. And then the other guy that I think, could be a decent ad for us is Christian Miller at the 3-tech. If we can get him in the second round, I would like that. I think he's got great form. He creates great separation, really coached well at Georgia. I think he needs to develop a little bit more in his pass rush bag and kind of improve his lateral speed. He does a great job of winning sometimes, but then he doesn't, really take that gap and just actually win the rep, right? He does a great job winning with his hands, but not, I think that step like past the offensive lineman when you turn on the film, it's just like, it's not there sometimes, right? It's, you make that step and it's just like a slow, methodical, and then it gives offensive linemen that ability to kind of recover and just, slide and knock him out. So, I don't know. I liked him, but he was lower on my list. I think I had him at 6, but I think he'd be a good second-round pick. A lot of these other guys, I think between size or just lack of position versatility, maybe they're more nose tackles. I don't really think we need a nose tackle with Roach and DJ Jones in the fold. So I'm looking for a 3-tech, that maybe a guy that can be used as a bit of a chess piece and has some position versatility. But I think in the first, second, and third round, we should really target an interior defensive lineman and an interior offensive lineman, or even a tackle. I think we need to add to the trenches and start thinking about the long term, because we got a lot of guys there that are highly paid, and maybe eventually you got to move on from one of those guys. So that'll do it for the draft fits. Now we'll move into David Montgomery's discussion. As I mentioned earlier, we brought in this offensive assistant who was David Montgomery's quarterback in college, and Lou Ianni was David Montgomery's running back coach in college. They're talking about maybe moving on from David Montgomery over there in Detroit. I think it became apparent that it was kind of the Jahmyr Gibbs show at the end of the year. David didn't have as efficient of a year as I think he had in years past. But I think, some of that might have definitely been just because he wasn't getting consistent enough looks. So, if you're not going to bring back J.K. Dobbins, and you kind of miss out on, you'd move on from JK because of injury history, but not because of production or how he fit with our team. And then if you're not going to, hit on Kenneth Walker or Breece Hall, I wouldn't mind David Montgomery. I think he brings that power aspect and that inside the tackle running that we need opposite of RJ Harvey. He's decent in the pass game as well, big physical guy. And he brings a little bit of that gadget too. He's a quarterback in high school, so he can throw. Dan Campbell made sure that you knew that they throw the ball in the red zone way too often with him. But, I'm sure Sean and John Morton, who, another connection, right? John Morton was over there with Dave Montgomery, but he was kind of part of the whole changing the guard. And that's why I think maybe it was kind of a scapegoat thing. Maybe Dan Campbell had more of his hands in the pot, and maybe Montgomery would be open to reuniting with John Morton. But I think that this would be, maybe a move that post free agency, you missed out on some of those guys. JK's around, or maybe JK signs somewhere else, and you send a 5th round pick, a later day 3 pick for Dave Montgomery. Certainly wouldn't mind it. Based on the cap hit for a 5th round pick, I think he's got 2 years left on his deal. I wouldn't hate it. A 4th, maybe. I'm not sending a day 2 pick, though. I'm definitely not doing that. I think you could bring JK back for a 1-year deal, or try to hit on one of these other guys in the draft. But I think David Montgomery would be a solid option to add next to RJ Harvey if we missed out on some of those other guys. But, of course, as I mentioned, the upper echelon of guys, Kenneth Walker, Breece Hall, that's where we should be. We should try to be hitting on that, because I think an improved run game only makes the life easier on Bo Nix, but I think it really takes it to the next level. And we have such a good offensive line that a running back can be an all-pro running back in this offense. I think there's no excuse for kind of the running back play that we had in the latter half of the season. Dobbins was awesome. He was a top 3 rusher before he got hurt, but RJ just wasn't doing it. And some of those other guys, they're best suited as depth pieces. So I would not mind David Montgomery. But last up, we're going to do a little bit of a mock draft. Obviously last episode, like I said, I did a mock draft in association with a whole offseason video. We use Stick with the Model. Today we're going to use PFN. PFN is one of the only ones that you can kind of get a good 7-round mock on. So we're going to do that one today once this loads. But yeah, I think in this scenario, we'll have our 2nd-round pick like we didn't have in the last episode, because I traded for A.J. Brown. So, this gives us a little bit of a different perspective. I think last video, we took in the 1st round, we took Thanks. I think in the 3rd, we got Keelan Rutledge. So, this will be interesting to see who can we get in the 2nd round of today's episode. So, let's see this one. So we go 7-round fast. We want to get through this pretty quick, and we'll go with Denver. Get these ads out of the way. So obviously here at the end of the 1st round, we're targeting interior defensive line, and I'm not going to do any trades in this episode, but Caleb Banks goes to the 49ers. That's a big hit. So I think at this point, and wow, Caden Proctor, I mean, that's really, really early for him. Like I said, I would take him as a developmental guy. But so Caleb Banks off the board. Kenyon Sadiq, I know everyone's going to be calling for this guy. I don't think he is a 1st-round tight end. I'd way rather just have Evan Ingram and draft a guy later. In this episode, I'm assuming that we don't bring back JFM and don't anywhere else. This defense needs to get stronger. If we're going to lose JFM, let's add Lee Hunter on the inside. I think that he brings that physicalness and that pure power that JFM has. So, and especially, hindsight's 2020, but Christian Miller just went right before us. So we would be in a not so great spot if, all 3 of the guys that we wanted didn't land to us. The guys that I mentioned earlier. Chase Bisontis went to the Saints. Screw you, Jenks. I liked him. Blake Miller went. So we're here at 62. We could take Oscar Delp. He's an option at the receiver position. I think, wide receiver, Skylar Bell was a guy that was pretty high on. Elijah Sarad. Let's see, what kind of guards are we working with? I saw Jennings Dunker. Keelan Rutledge here would be an option, but it's a little early for him, I fear. Offensive tackle, I wasn't in love with any of these guys on tape, especially on World or Tiernan. Oscar Delp could be an option here. I feel like he was kind of underutilized at Georgia. Jadarian Price could be an option. Say that we don't trade for David Montgomery. Jadarian Price has been a guy that they've talked about us taking at pick 30. I think that he could be an awesome option there. Linebacker, Jacob Rodriguez went. I love Jacob Rodriguez as a former linebacker. I mentioned in the last episode. We met with Jake Goldday. I think at the end of the day, we're going to go with Oscar Delp. We do need to add to the tight end room. I have faith in Evan Ingram, but let's add Delp as kind of a versatile tight end that I think, like I said, I think he could have been utilized a little bit better at Georgia. So now we fall here in the third round. I'm going to take Keelan Rutledge. I think this is a great spot for him here in the third. I imagine, just like in our last video, we cut Ben Powers, we bring back Palczewski. We need to bring in some depth and some competition for him. So we're going to go with Keelan Rutledge here at guard. Then in the fourth round, we got a couple different ways we can go. Let's see. We talked about this earlier. Where are the safeties at? I don't know if Kamari Ramsey already went. It doesn't look like it, unless they had him going in the second round. Let's search Ramsey. Huh. Wow. They must have had him going pretty early. Which a little in the second round. Wow. I listen, I like Kamari Ramsey. I just don't know that he is second round talent safety level. But I mean, this class isn't very deep, so I could see maybe why it goes that high. We can look at the linebacker position. What pick are we at? We are at pick 108. Pretty good value for Harold Perkins. I think Kyle Lewis is the guy. He had a really strong Senior Bowl. He's a very fast, athletic linebacker. Depending on what we do in free agency, if we bring back Singleton, this could be a guy that you develop behind him or maybe even takes his role. One of the reporters yesterday, I forget who it was, but he said this could be a Derek Brooks type of guy. So I'm going to take Kyle Lewis here. I like him as a true athlete, very athletic linebacker. It's what we need. Next up, we're not going to go edge. We already went interior defensive line. Corner, I think we're fine on. Safety a little bit early for Bishop. I think we can get him later. Let's look at the offensive side of the ball. So we could go wide receiver here. Could go running back as another option. I like Kalen Black. The receivers here I'm not very high on any of them. Maybe, this is a tough one, right? Because we're here in that second, fourth round pick, and we don't love anyone. Like maybe Denver would trade back, or maybe we do go with a second defensive lineman. And I know I said we don't really need a nose tackle, but Malcolm Roach can play a little bit more of the 3-tech if we want. Dante Corleone is a really, really good player. I think he kind of reminds me of DJ Jones, as that, he can move really well down the line. He's an athletic guy. He brings a lot of power in the run game. He could be maybe a DJ Jones replacement in the long term. So we're going to go with Corleone here in our second, fourth round pick. Just take best player available, not really reaching for anyone that, in our needs or anything like that. Next up, here in the fifth round, could look at the receiver room again. I'm just not in love with any of these guys. Defensively, could be early to take Bishop still. I think that PFN has Bishop Fitzgerald ranked way too low, in my opinion. Could go with another linebacker. Eric Gentry's a long guy. Bryce Boucher is a good, really good linebacker. Could go with a tackle. I think that maybe we just take another linebacker. I think we add to some more depth here. Bryce Boucher, Oregon guy, has a lot of respect for Bo. He gets my respect. We take Bryce Boucher here in the fifth round. Then we jump all the way to the third round. The seventh round. We have 3 picks in the seventh round. I think here we're going to have to go with Bishop Fitzgerald finally. Like I said, I love this prospect. I think he'd be a great fit as a replacement for PJ Locke. Oh, they only got us 2 sevenths in this one, huh? I believe we have 3, but you know why we had 3? We made that trade with the Eagles in the last one. So on the offensive side, I think we're going to finish this off with the same way that we finished the last one. We're going to take our gadget guy. He's that wide receiver on PFN. We're going to take our gadget guy and Eli Hendenrich. He's, like I mentioned in the last episode, he's a guy that has caught a lot of balls in college, ran a lot of, had a lot of touches at the running back position. Can be a fullback. I think he kind of is that Taysom Hill for you, where he's a special teamer that you can kind of put in a bunch of different positions and utilize as just a chess piece. Overall, not bad. You get Lee Hunter to play next to Zach. You get Delp to kind of develop behind Ingram, Keelan Rutledge, competition with Palczewski. Lewis develops behind, whoever you bring in at linebacker. Corleone is your next DJ Jones. Bocher also development. A lot of depth. But you look at the Denver Broncos roster, right? And it's not a roster that lacks talent, right? There's talent all over the field. I think Lee Hunter's your only real starter that you add. Maybe Dell pushes, maybe Rutledge pushes, but Lee Hunter's probably your starter day one. And most of your other positions, I think you address in free agency and trade with the amount of cap space that you can create. So I think overall, this would be a really solid class for me. I think a lot of guys that could develop into starters and would be really good depth pieces for the Denver Broncos moving forward. So, that'll do it for this episode. Let me know what you think about some of the draft fits that I mentioned. I think I'm a little bit higher on some of those interior defensive line guys than maybe other guys are. And I'm a little bit lower than on David Montgomery than some of the Broncos fans on Twitter are. But I think we all agree that, really great staff moves overall. So, like I said, make sure you go check out the Jenks Island podcast, some of the episodes that we've been dropping. This upcoming week, we're going to drop a tight ends and a free agency video. So 2 videos coming out this next week. I will also drop a video ahead of free agency targeting a couple of different guys and then talking about some of the tight end fits that I think would be awesome for us. Maybe we'll have 2, new staff positions or even 3 if we had Mike Zimmer at that point in time. So, a lot to look forward to. Make sure you check out the Kurt Heads podcast as well. Hammer's producing some good content over there for any of you guys who know some Packers fans. But make sure you comment, like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter /X, Instagram, and TikTok. And keep an eye out for upcoming videos from me as well. So thank you guys for tuning in and see you guys next time.